an investor in Bytedance. Help us understand what this $400 billion investment really means. Is this coming from Bytedance's other ventures, or is this just really a TikTok story?
Jackie, thanks so much for having me on. Appreciate it. I think the valuations that people are holding these companies at, and remember, unlike people, the general public, the people valuing these companies have access to the company financials. And I'm not going to sit and talk about the financials about, a private company on TV. However, the fundamentals of the business are extremely strong. And I think this is actually more of a Chinese story supporting the fundamentals than a U.S. TikTok story. Look, in our model, we actually zero out the U.S. business and make it worth nothing. And we've done that over the last year or so because there's so much uncertainty with what's going on. Well, you can make it work very well valuing the business in the U.S. at zero.
Well, that's what I'm curious about here, Mitchell, because when we talk about this idea, particularly this run-up we've seen in a lot of the other stocks in China, on this idea that there is not just homegrown in terms of the supply of what's going on to this market, but the idea that the demand itself will also be homegrown. In your model, you think that's enough to justify the run-up that we've seen in some of these names?
The Chinese business is gigantic. Keep in mind, these valuations you're seeing are as of 12/31. A lot of the Chinese run-up has come in the last month, 6 weeks. And so public comparables, if you were to look at a Tencent or an Alibaba, which are probably the two best comps, those stocks have actually done very well over the last 45 days. And so that wouldn't actually, that run-up, it hasn't even been factored into that $400 billion in price.
Talk to us about where this leaves Bytedance in this broader array of tech companies that are trying to notch a lead in generative AI. Where does this leave Bytedance, and could 2025 be the year that China really makes a dent compared to some of the AI giants we've seen as of late out of Silicon Valley?
I wouldn't bet against China. They were some of the foremost innovators around e-commerce. So if you look at companies like Alibaba or PDD, Pinduoduo, or Tencent in the gaming space, some of the best innovations around e-commerce have come out of China. If you read a lot of government Chinese policy around what they're trying to do, around whether it's chips, semiconductors, rare earth, I would expect that they're going to make a serious play in AI. Whether DeepSeek is that one or is it some other one? I think DeepSeek does show that there will be a lot of innovation, not only by Chinese companies but American companies as well, around AI and the software and using software to make AI much more powerful and cheaper. And I still believe AI today is massively hyped and will under-deliver in the near term. But over the next 10, 20 years, it will massively over-deliver to what people think. People always overestimate the near term and underestimate the long term when it comes to technological change. I think you're going to see the same thing here. And I joke in 1997, it could cost you $50 million from Sun Microsystems to build a website. You can build the same website today, you and I, for $10 with our credit card. The same thing is going to happen with AI. And so I think we are in the really early innings, and I would expect to see Chinese companies, really, try to drive to the forefront of that, just as American companies are going to as well.
Mitchell, obviously here in Washington, we're seeing President Trump ratchet up those tensions with Beijing via tariffs. Chip exports are also part of the uncertainty there. How will the U.S. potentially kneecap China's ability to gain ground? TikTok has been an interesting political story as well. How are you thinking about the political risks around the company? I know you said you're zeroing it out in your model, but do you think at all that TikTok story is going to weigh on the Bytedance prospects going forward?
I am not a political strategist. I assure you, if you're asking me about what to do for political strategy, you should probably do the opposite of anything that I would say. Again, we value the U.S. business at nothing because of so much uncertainty. What I will say is if you were to go back and look what happened on the weekend that they shut it down, they clearly shut it down. The Chinese did, because they were going to be in infringement with a bunch of service providers who then take legal risks, so they need to shut it down. Both sides of the aisle in Washington came running to try to keep it open. So you appear, if you look at from the outside, that both parties in Washington want to keep this app around for, I don't know, probably a host of reasons. And so I think we just have to watch and see what happens. But I don't have any, frankly, the fact that you're in Washington and a journalist, you probably have more opinions and insight into the political strategy of Washington.
But your opinion, though, as an investor matters in this as well, even if you don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of Washington, because I am curious, Mitchell, about just this idea of the whatever economic or financial relationship the U.S. and China will have in a formal capacity. And if that is a thing of the past, to the point where you have to start looking at Chinese businesses in the U.S. as basically being worth nothing, and maybe the flip side of that for U.S. businesses in China, I mean, when do you get to the point where you feel comfortable in making that call?
Well, we invested in a Chinese company, right, over the last year as we bought Bytedance stock. And so we just don't need the math to work, given how well the business is doing in China. That being said, I suspect this is all going to get tied up, whether it's tariffs, TikTok. I'm sure this is all on the table, and that the relevant parties are negotiating, and it's all in a bucket, and a lot of this is intertwined. Again, but I have no unique insight into that. All I know is that I can buy when we were buying Bytedance. We did not need to put any value in the U.S. business because of how cheap we were able to buy the overall business related to it. And that's more just about, I just don't know if the app's going to stay on or not. Now, what happened 6 weeks ago would lead me to believe more that some sort of deal will happen. What that deal looks like is your guess is as good as mine. I suspect there will be, if some deal does happen, I think one thing that people don't remember here is that roughly 60-ish% of the company is owned by non-Chinese investors, and 40% is owned by Chinese people. So does some sort of deal spin it out, and that 40% becomes slightly less? Your guess is fine. I would expect if some sort of deal happens, that it will be large U.S. strategics that are investors. The likes of Microsoft's, Amazon's, Oracle's, versus an individual investor group. Just given the quantum of dollars that we're talking here. This is a very valuable